Daniel Carter, a decorated Air Force veteran and seasoned commercial pilot, walked into the bustling airport, his uniform radiating the legacy of his achievements. Yet despite the authority and honor stitched into every thread of his attire, a flight attendant, clouded by assumptions, decided he didn't belong in first class. Her subtle remarks and dismissive attitude sparked a confrontation that would challenge everything she believed. By the time the flight landed, her perspective on respect and justice would never be the same. What happens when bias meets quiet dignity? This is a powerful story of resilience, transformation, and a lesson delivered with grace under pressure. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments. If you're inspired by stories of justice, redemption, and courage, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more impactful stories to audiences worldwide. Now, let's get into the story. Daniel Carter stood in the cramped, fluorescent-lit airport restroom, adjusting the collar of his decorated Air Force uniform. The medals pinned to his chest caught the harsh light, glinting with the weight of history and sacrifice. At 6'2", with a posture straight as an arrow, Daniel exuded a quiet authority that demanded respect. Yet, in moments like this, alone with his thoughts, the uniform felt heavier than usual. His reflection stared back at him, solemn and introspective. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small worn object, his father's pilot wings. The metal, dulled by years of handling, gleamed in his eyes like a beacon. He ran his thumb over the edges, tracing the grooves with a reverence born of memory. Those wings carried stories he could never forget. He was 8 years old, cross-legged on the living room floor, staring up at his father, Captain James Carter. James's uniform, immaculate and dignified, had seemed larger than life. These wings, his father had said, holding the small pin aloft, represent more than flying. They're about earning your place in a world that may not want to see you succeed. The words had been heavy, too heavy for a child to fully grasp. But as Daniel grew, so did his understanding of their meaning. His father's journey as one of the first black commercial pilots for Skyway Airlines had been marked by whispered remarks, suspicious glances, and overt hostility. Yet James had carried himself with unshakable dignity, his resolve as steady as the planes he piloted. "You don't fight hate with anger," his father had often said. "You fight it by soaring higher." Those lessons of perseverance and pride became the cornerstone of Daniel's own life. From excelling in school to earning a place at the Air Force Academy, he carried his father's wings, both literally and metaphorically, through every challenge. They became a talisman, a reminder of his heritage and his mission. Now, decades later, Daniel's record was nothing short of exemplary. He had flown countless combat missions during Desert Storm, his precision and composure under pressure, earning him the respect of his peers and the Air Medal with Valor. His transition to civilian life had been just as successful, rising to senior pilot at Skyway Airlines, where he took pride in mentoring younger aviators, especially those from minority backgrounds. Today, however, the uniform wasn't for a routine flight. Today, he was headed to Evergreen Memorial Cemetery to honor a fallen comrade. He glanced at his reflection one last time, adjusting his tie with meticulous care. Every detail of his appearance had to be perfect. It wasn't vanity, it was necessity. Daniel knew all too well that men like him were scrutinized under a magnifying glass. The smallest imperfection could become an excuse for doubt. The airport terminal buzzed with its usual chaos. Families wrangling children, business travelers checking their watches, announcements echoing over the intercom. Daniel walked toward his gate, his presence commanding subtle glances from the crowd. Some eyes reflected admiration. Others held quiet hesitation. He recognized that look. The unspoken acknowledgement of his achievements, shadowed by lingering stereotypes. As he waited to board, his thoughts drifted to Captain Tom "Eagle" Evans. Eagle had been more than a comrade. He had been a mentor, a brother in arms. Together, they had flown countless missions, their lives often hanging by a thread of trust in each other. Eagle's booming laugh and unyielding optimism had been a beacon during the darkest days of war. The thought of his absence tightened Daniel's chest, a hollow ache that words could not fill. The gate attendant looked up as he approached. And that's when everything changed. The young man at the gate, barely out of his 20s, straightened upon seeing Daniel Carter's uniform. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, his tone respectful yet tentative. "Thank you," Daniel replied, offering a polite nod before stepping through the gate and into the first-class cabin, a sanctuary of leather seats and muted tones. Settling into his aisle seat, he stowed his small leather carry-on and adjusted his cuffs, his movements precise and practiced. The hum of the engines beneath him was a comforting vibration, familiar and steady. Passengers filed in one by one, absorbed in their own worlds. A mother struggled with a stroller, her toddler clutching a stuffed bear. A businessman spoke sharply into his phone, his tone impatient. A young couple giggled nervously, their excitement palpable. Daniel's gaze lingered on an elderly man wearing a vintage bomber jacket. The faded patches on the jacket hinted at decades of stories Daniel could almost hear. Their eyes met, and the man gave a slight nod of recognition. Military. The bond was unspoken, but immediate. Leaning back, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of relaxation, though his mind remained alert. Years of military service had trained him to stay aware, to observe. The flight to Evergreen Memorial Cemetery wasn't long, but its purpose lent it a gravity that stretched time. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his father's pilot wings once more. The worn metal felt cool against his fingers, its grooves as familiar as a prayer. He held it tightly, his lips forming a silent promise. "This one's for you, Dad." The words carried both the weight of loss and the strength of legacy. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, Daniel closed his eyes, steadying himself for the journey ahead. Across the city, in an immaculate apartment, Victoria Langley adjusted her perfectly tailored blazer, smoothing the fabric over her shoulders as she stood before the full-length mirror. The light streaming through the large windows reflected off polished surfaces, amplifying the order she worked so hard to maintain. Every detail, from the carefully arranged books to the fresh flowers in the vase, spoke of a curated life, one meticulously designed to project control and perfection. Yet, as Victoria studied her reflection, the cracks in that image felt closer than ever. She leaned in, inspecting her makeup. The soft pink lipstick, the delicate eyeliner, the flawless contour, it all contributed to the illusion of effortless elegance. But nothing about Victoria was effortless. Every detail was deliberate, a carefully constructed shield against the unpredictable nature of the world. Her gaze drifted to her phone, where a new comment on her latest social media post caught her attention. "You're the definition of grace." Her lips curved into a practiced smile, but the warmth never reached her eyes. Beneath the surface, a restless unease simmered. Her gaze fell on the leather-bound album resting on the edge of the coffee table. It had been there for weeks, untouched since the day she found it. Victoria's fingers twitched, drawn to it, but she resisted. She didn't need to reopen it. The images were burned into her memory. The discovery had been unexpected, a jarring interruption to the pristine narrative of her family's legacy. Black and white photographs of her grandfather revealed a man she barely recognized. His proud stance among hateful symbols shook the foundation of everything she thought she knew. That day, she had been searching for a childhood photo for a work project when she stumbled upon the album. She still remembered the cold weight in her hands as she flipped through the pages, each image a piece of a story she wasn't prepared to confront. Her grandfather had always been a figure of admiration, a self-made man whose charisma and success were celebrated. But these photos painted a darker picture, one that cast a long shadow over the carefully crafted Langley name. Victoria closed her eyes, her hand tightening around her phone. The weight of the discovery had lingered ever since, disrupting the pride she had always carried. How much of her success, she wondered, was truly her own? How much was built on a foundation she could no longer fully respect? The phone vibrated in her hand, snapping her back to the present. She checked the time. She needed to leave for her flight. With a steadying breath, she grabbed her neatly packed bag and stepped out of the apartment. The click of her heels echoed in the hallway, her composure outwardly intact. She moved with the confidence of someone who had mastered the art of appearances. The drive to the airport was uneventful, but beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. She tried to push them aside, reminding herself that her job required focus. As a senior flight attendant, Victoria prided herself on professionalism. Once she stepped into the terminal, she would become the polished, unshakable version of herself that the world expected to see. Little did she know, today's flight would change everything. Victoria Langley had spent years mastering the art of composure. It was why her colleagues had given her the nickname Unflappable Langley early in her career, a title she had worn like armor. By the time she arrived at the airport, the mask was firmly in place. Her colleagues greeted her warmly as she entered the crew lounge, and she responded with the same practiced charm that had earned her a reputation for excellence. "Morning, everyone," she said, her tone light and pleasant. If anyone noticed the tension behind her smile, they didn't show it. Victoria reviewed the passenger list, noting the names of VIPs in first class. Her attention to detail remained sharp, her uniform impeccable. Yet as she caught her reflection in the lounge's glass door, she paused for a fraction of a second. The image staring back at her was flawless, but it felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter the illusion she had built. When boarding began, Victoria took her position at the front of the cabin, greeting passengers with her signature poise. Each interaction was smooth and professional, her voice steady and warm. Then, a tall man in a decorated Air Force uniform stepped onto the plane. Something shifted. His commanding presence drew every eye in the cabin, including hers. For a brief moment, her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, directing him to his seat in first class with practiced ease. The rest of the passengers filed in, filling the cabin with the familiar hum of conversations and rustling bags. Victoria moved through the aisles, assisting where needed, her expression calm and composed. But her thoughts drifted, circling back to the album, the one she had avoided for weeks, and to the man in the uniform. She couldn't explain why he unsettled her, but the unease lingered, intertwining with the shadows of her family's past. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Victoria took her seat for the safety demonstration. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her posture flawless. But inside, her mind was anything but orderly. The weight of her grandfather's history pressed against her, merging with the questions she had long avoided. For the first time, she wondered if the world she had built for herself could withstand the truth. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. The airport terminal buzzed with the energy of travelers moving with purpose, the rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels blending with the echo of announcements overhead. Colonel Samuel "Sam" Reynolds walked through the bustling space with deliberate ease, a man whose every step seemed to carry the weight of history. His vintage bomber jacket, worn and patched from decades of service, was more than just clothing. It was a testament to his life. Though the silver in his hair and the lines etched into his face hinted at his years, his posture remained upright, his gaze steady. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had weathered the storms of life and emerged intact. As he approached the gate, Sam took in the scene with the practiced eye of a seasoned observer. Families herding restless children, business travelers tapping furiously on their devices, solo passengers sitting with headphones, lost in their own worlds. One figure stood out, a tall man in a crisp Air Force uniform near the boarding area. Sam's eyes lingered on him, noting the quiet strength in his stance. It wasn't just the uniform that drew his attention, but the way the man's presence seemed to command respect. Sam felt an unspoken bond, the kind that only those who had served could understand. Nearby, Victoria Langley adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her polished smile firmly in place as she greeted passengers. The routine was second nature by now, each interaction rehearsed to perfection. Yet, as the line moved forward, her focus wavered. When she caught sight of the Air Force officer, something about him unsettled her. His presence seemed to ripple through the atmosphere, shifting the balance she worked so hard to maintain. She quickly redirected her thoughts, reminding herself to stay composed. This flight, like any other, demanded her best. Sam approached Victoria, his steady gaze meeting hers as she directed him to a seat in first class. For a brief moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing a flicker of discomfort as her eyes caught the patches on his jacket. They told stories she couldn't begin to understand, but the weight of them lingered. Sam gave her a polite nod, his sharp eyes catching the fleeting crack in her facade before he moved on. Moments later, Daniel Carter entered the cabin, his polished uniform catching the light as he walked with calm assurance. Conversations quieted as passengers took notice. Some openly admired his presence. Others stole subtle glances. Victoria greeted him with her usual practiced warmth, but as he approached, her smile faltered. There was a gravity about him, a silent authority that was impossible to ignore. Guiding him to his seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be different, and that, whether she was ready or not, something was about to change. Victoria Langley stood at the front of the cabin, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture perfectly composed. Yet beneath the surface, tension coiled in her muscles, betraying the calm she projected. From his seat, Colonel Sam Reynolds observed the interaction between her and Daniel Carter closely. He didn't know the details, but decades of experience had taught him to recognize the undercurrents of human behavior. The hesitation in Victoria's demeanor, the quiet strength in Daniel's movements, the subtle shifts in the cabin's atmosphere, all spoke of a story waiting to unfold. Sam's gaze lingered on the air medal with valor pinned to Daniel's chest, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. It stirred something deep within him, a recognition of the weight this man carried, a silent acknowledgement, a respect shared between warriors who had faced the unthinkable. As the boarding process continued, Victoria moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, assisting passengers and maintaining her polished exterior. But her thoughts kept circling back to the Air Force officer. His presence felt like a mirror, reflecting her own unease, stirring questions she wasn't ready to face. The images from the album at home resurfaced in her mind, the weight of her family's legacy pressing against the carefully constructed world she had built. When Victoria paused near Sam to offer a drink, he seized the opportunity. "That young man in the uniform," he said, his voice low but firm. "He's earned every bit of respect those medals represent. Make sure you remember that." The words struck deeper than Sam could have anticipated. Victoria's cheeks flushed, her nod polite but distant. She moved on quickly, but the remark lingered, echoing in her mind as she completed her duties. Had Sam seen through her? Had he sensed the conflict she worked so hard to hide? For the first time, she wondered if her flawless image was as unshakable as she had convinced herself it was. A few rows ahead, Daniel Carter remained focused on the tablet in his hands, seemingly unaware of the dynamics unfolding around him. But years of navigating similar situations had sharpened his instincts. He knew the looks, the whispers, the subtle shifts in tone. They had followed him from the cockpit to the classroom, from the barracks to the boardroom. He navigated them with the same precision he brought to his flight plans, calm, steady, and unyielding. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the tension in the cabin became almost tangible. Victoria took her seat for takeoff, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture perfect. Across the aisle, Sam adjusted his seatbelt, his expression thoughtful as his gaze shifted between Victoria and Daniel. He could feel it, the weight of history in the air, the unspoken stories that connected them all. This wasn't just another flight. Something larger was at play, an intersection of lives and legacies that couldn't be ignored. The engines roared to life. The plane ascended. Victoria stared straight ahead, her composure intact. But inside, her thoughts churned with questions she had long avoided. Sam closed his eyes, a quiet resolve settling over him. And Daniel remained still, his focus unwavering. The plane climbed higher, but the weight of what was left unspoken hung heavy in the cabin, waiting for its moment to surface. A memory buried in time. As the plane leveled off, Colonel Sam Reynolds adjusted his seatbelt, his eyes drifting once more to the air medal with valor on Daniel's chest. The sight stirred something deep within him, a memory buried beneath decades of silence. He had seen that medal before, pinned to the uniform of another man, a man whose courage had changed his life forever. The hum of the engines faded into the background as Sam's thoughts pulled him back to a humid night in 1968 deep in the jungles of Vietnam. Their squadron had been ambushed, the convoy pinned down by relentless enemy fire. The radio crackled with urgency, desperate calls for air support, and then the roar of an engine overhead. A C-130 swooping low over the treetops. The pilot's voice came through the static, calm and steady. "Hold your position. Help is on the way." The man behind that voice had been Captain David Lawson, a black pilot whose name was whispered with reverence among the troops. Sam had watched from the ground as the aircraft performed maneuvers that seemed impossible, providing cover and drawing enemy fire away from the squadron. Against all odds, Captain Lawson's actions had allowed Sam and his men to escape with their lives. Sam could still remember the aftermath. The way Captain Lawson had stepped out of the cockpit with quiet dignity, brushing off the awestruck gratitude of the soldiers he had saved. Lawson had been awarded the Air Medal with Valor for his bravery. But Sam knew the recognition hadn't shielded him from the prejudice that followed. Sam had seen it. In the way some officers hesitated to shake his hand. In the way his promotions came slower than they should have. In the way his legacy had been written in whispers rather than headlines. And now, decades later, Sam found himself staring at another man wearing that same medal. A new generation. A different war. But the same fight. The weight of it all settled heavy in Sam's chest. He had spent his life remembering Captain Lawson's bravery. But today, he wondered if he had done enough to honor it. And if the man sitting just a few rows ahead of him, Daniel Carter, was still fighting battles Lawson had already won. The past and present collided in Sam's mind. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to make peace with it. Decades ago, Captain David Lawson had stood tall in the face of resistance, carrying himself with quiet dignity despite the whispered doubts that tried to diminish his heroism. His courage had been undeniable, his skill as a pilot unmatched. But for some, that had never been enough. Colonel Sam Reynolds had witnessed it firsthand. He had seen the way some officers refused to meet Lawson's eyes, how his victories were questioned in ways that others were not. Yet Lawson never wavered. Back in the present, Sam's gaze lingered on Daniel Carter, noting the quiet strength in his posture. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, a shared resilience that transcended decades. Sam felt an urge to speak, to tell Daniel about Lawson and the debt he owed to a man who had sacrificed so much simply for doing his duty. But he held back. Some stories had to be told at the right time, and some men carried their own stories, ones they might not yet be ready to share. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as the flight attendants began their service. Victoria Langley moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, her polished demeanor intact. But inside, her thoughts were anything but calm. She couldn't shake the weight of Sam's earlier comment. His words had felt like a spotlight, illuminating the cracks in the image she had spent years perfecting. As she passed by Daniel's seat, her gaze lingered for just a second too long. The medals on his chest spoke of experiences she couldn't fathom, sacrifices she couldn't measure, and something about that unsettled her. She had spent her entire career in control. But right now she wasn't sure what she felt. Sam noticed. His seasoned eyes caught the tension in Victoria's movements, the small hesitations that most would overlook. He had spent a lifetime reading people, and he recognized conflict when he saw it. What burden was she carrying? What battle was she fighting behind that polished smile? Over the years, Sam had learned that everyone carried their own conflicts, often invisible, but no less significant. This flight might have been just another workday for Victoria, but something told him it was becoming much more than that. The plane was a confined space, and yet it had a way of revealing truths that people might otherwise keep buried. The cabin settled into a steady rhythm. Passengers lost themselves in their own worlds. Sam leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting once more to Lawson. He remembered the long nights after missions, the conversations they had shared. They had talked about strategy, about survival, and about a future where Lawson's children wouldn't have to fight for the respect he had to earn twice over. Lawson had believed in that future. Sam had admired his optimism. But even then, he had doubted the world's ability to change. Daniel's voice broke through Sam's thoughts. A few rows ahead, he had leaned over to help a passenger struggling with their luggage. His tone was calm and measured, his presence steady as he reassured them. Sam felt a swell of pride, as though the strength he had witnessed in Lawson all those years ago had found its echo in Daniel. It was a reminder of the enduring bond between those who served. A connection that transcended time and circumstance. Victoria's steps faltered as she approached Daniel's row. She hesitated, then she offered him a drink, her usual professional smile in place. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice steady but softer than usual. Daniel looked up. His expression was unreadable. "No, thank you," he replied. His tone was polite but detached. Their eyes met briefly, and for a split second, Victoria felt something she couldn't quite define. Respect? Curiosity? She wasn't sure, but it unsettled her. She moved on quickly, her thoughts racing. Sam watched the exchange, his mind turning over the parallels between past and present. He had seen men like Daniel Carter before, men who carried the weight of history on their shoulders while striving to build something better. And he had seen people like Victoria Langley, caught in the struggle between what they had been taught and what they were beginning to understand. The plane cruised through the clouds, and Sam felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He would tell Daniel about Lawson, about the night that had changed his life, about the courage that had left an indelible mark on his soul. But not yet. For now, he would wait. The stories in this cabin were still finding their voices, and Sam knew better than to rush the truth. It had a way of surfacing when the time was right. A moment of reckoning. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the cabin as Victoria Langley walked down the aisle. Her steps were measured, but her mind was restless. She glanced toward Daniel Carter, seated in the corner of first class. From the moment he boarded, something about him had unsettled her, and now, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface was starting to bubble over. There was something about him, the quiet authority, the weight of his medals, the way he carried himself. He made her question things she'd rather not confront. Victoria stopped beside his seat. Her professional smile remained in place, but her voice carried a slight edge. "Sir, I just want to confirm that you're in the correct seat." "First class is reserved for—" She hesitated. The words caught in her throat as Daniel looked up, his gaze meeting hers. His expression was calm, unyielding. He waited a beat before speaking. His voice was low and deliberate. I'm the pilot." The words hung in the air, their weight settling over the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude. Victoria Langley froze. The polished exterior she had worked so hard to maintain cracked under the impact. For a moment she didn't know how to respond. Her carefully curated world, built on assumptions and appearances, had been shattered by 3 simple words. Passengers turned to look, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, some voices tinged with surprise, others with shame. Colonel Sam Reynolds, seated a few rows away, straightened in his seat. He had seen moments like this before, moments that exposed hard truths in ways that could not be ignored. And he knew this was a moment that required his voice. Unbuckling his seatbelt, he stood. His presence commanded immediate attention. "This man," he said, his voice firm but calm, "has earned the respect of everyone on this plane. Those medals on his chest represent years of service and sacrifice. I suggest we all remember that." The cabin fell silent. The authority in Sam's tone left no room for argument. Victoria's cheeks burned. The weight of her actions fully registered. She looked at Daniel Carter, who remained composed, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time in a long time she felt something unfamiliar. Shame. Not just embarrassment, but the deep gnawing realization that her assumptions had blinded her to the truth. Daniel's voice broke the silence, calm and measured. "Thank you, Colonel," he said, "but I don't need anyone to speak for me." He turned to Victoria, his tone softening just slightly. "I've faced moments like this my entire life." Then, with quiet intensity, he added, "What matters is what you do with it now." Victoria nodded, her throat tight. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she could offer. She stepped back, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her tray. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the galley. Her mind spun with questions she couldn't yet answer. The cabin shifted. Passengers exchanged glances, their earlier curiosity giving way to quiet reflection. Some avoided looking at Daniel altogether, their discomfort evident. Others nodded subtly in his direction, their expressions a mix of respect and regret. Sam Reynolds returned to his seat, his face thoughtful as he observed the ripple effect of what had just occurred. Daniel leaned back, his gaze steady as he stared out the window. He had long since learned to navigate moments like these, but they never truly lost their sting. Sam watched him closely, seeing in Daniel a reflection of the men he had once served alongside, men who had faced not only the perils of war, but the burdens of prejudice. In the galley, Victoria stood before a polished metal cabinet. Her reflection stared back at her, unflinching, honest. The apology she had given felt hollow. But it was a start. She clenched her fists, vowing silently to do better, even if she wasn't sure what that meant yet. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. The tension in the air was palpable, but it carried with it a sense of possibility. For Victoria, the moment was a reckoning, a catalyst for change. For Daniel, it was another chapter in a lifetime of confronting prejudice with dignity. And for the passengers, it was an opportunity to confront their own assumptions, to see beyond the surface and recognize the humanity in each other. The engines hummed steadily as the plane cruised through the sky. But the true journey was unfolding within the hearts and minds of those on board. Sam closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting to memories of the past and hopes for the future. Victoria remained in the galley, feeling the weight of her own reflection. And Daniel sat quietly, the horizon stretching endlessly beyond the window. This was a flight none of them would forget, not because of the destination, but because of the transformation that had begun. As the clouds parted, revealing the vast expanse of sky, it became clear. This journey was about more than just reaching a place. It was about bridging the gap between perception and reality, between who they were and who they could become. What had begun as a private reckoning now carried the potential for public scrutiny. Videos of Daniel Carter's calm yet powerful words, "I'm the pilot," had already begun circulating online. The incident was gaining traction, captions ranging from indignant outrage to quiet reflection. The hum of the engines was now underscored by the soft tapping of fingers on screens, passengers already sharing their thoughts as the world outside the cabin began to take notice. Daniel sat by the window, his posture steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Years of enduring scrutiny had taught him to remain composed. But this moment carried an added layer of visibility. He was aware of the phones raised discreetly, of the eyes that lingered longer than necessary, of the whispers that moved through the cabin like an undercurrent. Yet he didn't fidget, didn't react. He sat still, his dignity unshaken, because that was what he had always done. Beside him, an older passenger leaned slightly closer, as if to offer silent solidarity. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was enough, a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that this moment, however painful, mattered. Colonel Sam Reynolds observed the scene from his seat. His sharp eyes caught the subtle shifts in the cabin, the discomfort etched onto some faces, the growing respect in others. It reminded him of moments from his own past, when walls of ignorance had been dismantled, brick by brick, often in the most unexpected ways. Across the aisle, Sam noticed a young couple whispering to each other, their glances toward Daniel tinged with a mix of curiosity and unease. It was a quiet but telling sign. Something had shifted, a perspective perhaps, a belief, beginning to unravel. Victoria Langley exhaled shakily and stepped out of the galley. Her movements were slower, more deliberate than before. She approached Daniel's row, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. "Would you like some water, sir?" she asked. Her voice was softer this time, stripped of the polished confidence she usually relied on. Daniel turned his gaze to her. His expression was unreadable. He nodded. She handed him the glass. Their fingers brushed briefly. The contact felt heavier than it should, laden with unspoken words she couldn't yet articulate. She moved on, her shoulders sagging slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Seated nearby, Sam Reynolds leaned back, his fingers steepled as he considered the scene unfolding. He had seen Victoria's type before. People raised to believe certain things, only to find those beliefs crumbling when confronted with the undeniable truth of another's humanity. It wasn't an easy path, but he had hope for her. He watched as she paused in the aisle, glancing back at Daniel before continuing her duties. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The quiet tension was broken by a chime from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the flight." The announcement carried an almost ironic weight, given the charged atmosphere in the cabin. Sam allowed himself a faint smile, recognizing the layers of leadership Daniel embodied, even from his passenger seat. Victoria returned to the galley, where her phone vibrated incessantly with notifications. She hesitated before picking it up. Her stomach sank as she saw the growing number of comments and shares. One post caught her eye. "We're all watching. What will you do next?" The words felt like a challenge, a reminder that her actions and inactions mattered. She set the phone down and looked back at her reflection. This time, she met her own gaze with a mix of determination and vulnerability. She didn't know exactly how to move forward, but she knew she couldn't continue as she had before. Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing at the glass of water Victoria had left him. It wasn't much, but the effort felt meaningful in its own way. He turned his attention back to the window. The vast expanse of sky was a reminder of the journeys he had taken, both literal and metaphorical. This flight felt different. Not because of the destination, but because of the weight it carried. He didn't know what would come of the video or the passenger reactions, but he knew he would face it, as he always had. Steadfast, unshaken. Sam closed his eyes, memories of the past mingling with hopes for the future. He thought of the men he had served with, men like Daniel, who had faced prejudice head-on with quiet resilience. He thought of the changes he had witnessed over the years, slow, imperfect, but undeniable. And he thought of Victoria, who was just beginning a journey of her own. It wasn't his place to guide her, but he trusted that she would find her way. As the plane cruised onward, the cabin settled into a subdued calm. Passengers returned to their books, their thoughts, their silence. But none of them were the same. Some moments change a destination, others change the people making the journey. This was one of those moments. The flight continued its course, steady. But for those on board, the journey was just beginning. The plane touched down smoothly, the hum of the engines fading into the background as passengers began gathering their belongings. Victoria Langley remained in the galley, her fingers gripping the edges of her phone. The incident from earlier in the flight had grown larger than her. It echoed in the glances of passengers, in the flood of notifications on her screen. Yet the weight she felt wasn't just about public scrutiny. It was personal, a reckoning she had never anticipated. As the passengers disembarked, Victoria moved methodically, offering polite smiles, murmuring parting remarks. Her colleagues cast glances her way, their curiosity palpable. But she avoided eye contact. Once the last passenger exited, she slipped into a quiet corner of the terminal and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over her mother's number before she pressed call. The line rang twice. "Sterling, honey, is everything okay?" Her mother's familiar voice carried warmth, but also concern. Victoria hesitated, her throat tightening. "Mom, I need to ask you about Grandpa." Her voice was unsteady. "About the photos I found." Silence. Heavy. Then her mother's voice, cautious. "What about them?" Victoria swallowed hard. "Why were they even in the house?" she asked, frustration creeping into her tone. "I thought I knew him, but seeing those—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Her mother sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that carried years of unspoken stories. "Your grandfather wasn't proud of that part of his life," she said softly. "He made some terrible choices when he was young, choices he regretted deeply. But he changed, Victoria. He spent decades trying to make amends, volunteering with civil rights groups, writing letters of apology to families he had hurt, even donating to causes he once stood against." Victoria's chest tightened. Her mind reeled. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I grew up thinking he was flawless. Now I don't know what to believe." Her mother's voice was gentle. "We wanted you to remember the man he became, not the man he used to be. But maybe we were wrong to shield you from the full story. Maybe knowing would have helped you understand earlier." Victoria leaned against the cold wall of the terminal, her breath shallow as she absorbed the revelation. Her grandfather's redemption complicated everything. But it also sparked something within her, a realization that change was possible, even for those who had started in the wrong place. She wiped her eyes and whispered, "Thanks, Mom. I'll call you later." A short distance away, Daniel Carter and Colonel Sam Reynolds sat in a quiet corner of the terminal waiting for their connecting flight. Sam was the first to break the silence, his tone reflective. "You remind me of someone I served with." His eyes were distant, lost in memory. "Captain David Lawson, one of the best pilots I ever knew." brave, steady, sharp as a tack. But he had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. Sam glanced at Daniel. Sound familiar? Daniel nodded, his lips tightening slightly. It's a story I've lived my whole life. But hearing it doesn't make it easier. Sam leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Lawson used to say something I've never forgotten, he said. You don't change minds by yelling. You do it by showing them who you are, over and over, until they have no choice but to see the truth. Sam met Daniel's gaze. That's what you're doing, son, and it matters. Daniel studied Sam for a long moment, then slowly a faint smile broke through his stoic demeanor. Thank you, Colonel. That means more than you know. Victoria stood nearby, watching the quiet conversation unfold. She felt an overwhelming urge to approach them, to apologize, to say something meaningful, but the weight of her earlier actions held her back. So she remained rooted in place. The words formed and dissolved in her mind. The arrival of the Skyway Airlines public relations team broke her reverie. Clad in sharp suits, they exuded the kind of polished efficiency designed to manage crises. One of them approached her directly, clipboard in hand. Miss Langley, we need a statement from you. His tone was curt. The company's priority was damage control, not understanding. Victoria nodded, her stomach twisting. She answered their questions as best she could. Each word weighed down by the knowledge that they were insufficient. That what had happened on that flight could not be fixed with a press release. It had to be lived. Understood. And she was only just beginning to understand. The terminal bustled with movement. Passengers continued on their journeys. But for some, like Victoria Langley, the real journey had only just begun. Across the terminal, Daniel Carter and Colonel Sam Reynolds observed the scene unfolding. Sam shook his head slightly. They're looking to patch the leak without fixing the pipe, he muttered. Daniel nodded, his voice measured. That's how these things usually go, but maybe this time something good will come out of it. Victoria Langley's gaze drifted toward Daniel. Their eyes met, briefly but meaningfully. His expression was calm, free of animosity, but it carried a quiet expectation. A challenge, rather than an accusation. Victoria straightened her shoulders. She turned back to the PR team and resolved to answer with honesty. Whatever came next, she wouldn't hide from it. The terminal buzzed with the energy of travelers moving toward their destinations. But for Victoria, Daniel, and Sam, this layover marked the beginning of something far more significant. Their paths had crossed in unexpected ways. And while the journey ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Change was already in motion. The earlier chaos of the terminal had quieted, ebbing into the measured rhythms of boarding calls and scattered conversations. Victoria lingered near the galley, her fingers trailing absently over the polished metal surface of a tray. The weight of the day pressed down on her, a blend of shame, uncertainty, and the faintest flicker of hope. She had taken the first steps toward confronting her own biases. But the path forward felt daunting, uncharted. She glanced toward Daniel Carter, who stood by the cockpit door, his uniform immaculate and his presence as steady as ever. He was speaking with Colonel Sam Reynolds, their conversation calm and reflective. Victoria hesitated, her pulse quickening. Apologizing wasn't new to her. She had mastered the art of surface-level contrition in her career. But this was different. This wasn't about smoothing over a mistake. This was about taking accountability. Drawing a deep breath, she approached. Her steps were measured, but her heart raced. Captain Carter, she said softly, her voice barely rising above the ambient noise. Daniel turned toward her, his expression neutral but attentive. Sam stepped back slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment, though his watchful presence remained steady. Victoria clasped her hands in front of her, steadying herself. I wanted to apologize, she began, her voice trembling, for earlier, and for everything that led up to it. I let my assumptions guide me, and I was wrong. I'm trying to understand, to do better. You deserved better than that. She paused, the words catching in her throat. She glanced briefly at the floor before forcing herself to look back at him. I thought you should know. Daniel studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Victoria felt the weight of his gaze, unyielding but not unkind. Finally he nodded. Acknowledging it is a start, he said evenly. But it's what you do next that matters. Victoria swallowed hard. the gravity of his words settling over her. I know. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Then, after a pause, I spoke to my mother earlier, about my grandfather. She told me things I didn't know, things he did to try to atone for his past. It made me realize how much I've hidden from myself, how much I've coasted on ignorance. I want to change that. Daniel's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained firm. Your grandfather made a choice to change, he said. That choice is always there, but it takes more than good intentions to follow through. Victoria nodded, her throat tight. I want to be better. Her voice was steadier now. I don't know how yet, but I'm willing to learn. The hum of the terminal seemed to recede, leaving only the quiet tension of the moment. Sam, observing from nearby, stepped forward. His voice was warm but resolute. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said, but it starts with moments like this. Victoria turned to Sam, her eyes glistening. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything you've done, and for reminding me that it's not too late. Sam gave her a small nod, his weathered face softening. It's never too late to do the right thing. Daniel glanced at Sam, a faint smile breaking through his stoic demeanor. Then he turned back to Victoria. If you're serious about change, it'll show in your actions, he said. Don't just talk about it, live it. Victoria nodded, her expression filled with quiet determination. I will. Thank you. The conversation settled into a natural pause, the weight of the exchange slowly giving way to a tentative calm. Victoria stepped back, giving Daniel and Sam space to continue their discussion. As she returned to her duties, she felt something unfamiliar. A strange mix of shame and relief. For the first time, the weight she carried felt lighter. Not because it was gone, but because she was finally confronting it. From his seat nearby, Sam watched Victoria's retreating figure, his expression thoughtful. She's got a long way to go, he said quietly to Daniel. Daniel nodded. We all do, he replied. But at least she started. The two men sat in companionable silence, the echoes of their conversation blending into the ambient noise of the terminal. The terminal buzzed with quiet energy, a space filled with fleeting moments and travelers moving toward their destinations. But among the shuffling crowds and murmured conversations, something subtler had taken root. A shift. An acknowledgement of the significance of the day. The crew's interactions carried an unspoken understanding, a ripple of quiet change. As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Daniel Carter stood, adjusting his uniform with the practiced precision of someone who understood the weight of his role. Beside him, Colonel Sam Reynolds followed, his bomber jacket an unspoken testament to the legacy he carried. Together, they walked toward the gate, their steps steady, purposeful. Behind them, Victoria Langley lingered for a moment. She watched the two men, awe and gratitude swelling within her. Then, with a steadying breath, she straightened her shoulders. The determination in her heart mirrored in her posture. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to rise. The glow of 1,000 screens illuminated the terminal. The viral video, Daniel Carter's calm declaration of "I'm the pilot," continued to spread. It had ignited a firestorm of discussion across social media and news outlets. The footage was brief, but its impact was profound. It had become a symbol, sparking conversations about bias, resilience, and dignity in the face of prejudice. Headlines ranged from celebratory to critical, each one reflecting the diverse reactions of a watching world. Some praised his composure. Others debated the necessity of such moments in today's world. The internet was never silent, never settled. But one thing was clear. The conversation was bigger than just this flight. Daniel sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, his phone resting in his hand. Notifications buzzed incessantly, yet he scrolled through them with a measured calm. He had seen this before, lived it before. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, celebrities, all had shared the video. Messages of admiration and outrage flooded his feed. But there were also detractors, the same voices that had always been there, questioning the necessity of these conversations, minimizing what had happened. Daniel's expression remained steady, but a subtle tension in his jaw betrayed the weight he carried. Across the terminal, Victoria Langley stood alone, her phone gripped tightly. She had watched the video, once, then again. Her own image was frozen alongside Daniel in the frame. The internet's judgment had been swift and unrelenting. Some excoriated her, painting her as a villain. Others offered cautious empathy, acknowledging her public apology and encouraging her to grow. Every message felt like a sharp tug at her resolve. But she forced herself to keep reading. This was her reality now, and looking away wouldn't change it. Earlier, her mother had called, her voice thick with worry. "I saw the video," she had said. "Are you all right?" Victoria had offered reassurances, but she wasn't sure she believed them herself. The shame she felt was raw, relentless, but beneath it, a flicker of determination. She glanced toward Daniel, seated with Sam Reynolds. The two men carried themselves with unshakable grace. If they could hold their ground under this level of scrutiny, surely she could find the strength to face her own flaws. Not far away, a cluster of Skyway Airlines PR representatives huddled in a corner. Their voices were low but urgent, their expressions tight with concern. The company's initial statement had been carefully crafted, acknowledging the incident, promising a review of training protocols. But the public's appetite for accountability had only grown. Hashtags like the secret pilot and dignity in flight trended worldwide, amplifying calls for systemic change within the airline industry. The PR team debated their next steps, the strain of the situation evident in their hurried tones and furrowed brows. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from his sister, Layla. "Saw the video. Proud of you as always. Call me when you can." A faint smile broke through his stoic expression. Her words were a small balm amid the noise. His family understood this struggle intimately. His father, one of the first black commercial pilots, had faced similar challenges, battles that rarely made headlines, but had shaped their family's legacy. What had happened on the plane was more than just a personal stand. It was a continuation of that legacy, a testament to the quiet strength his father had modeled. Veterans groups quickly rallied behind Daniel, sharing the video with messages of support and admiration. "This is what leadership looks like." One post read, accompanied by an image of Daniel in uniform. The solidarity of his fellow service members brought him comfort. It reminded him that the bonds forged in service transcended time and rank. Victoria read those posts too. Her chest tightened with a mixture of relief and guilt. The public's recognition of Daniel's composure was deserved. But it also reminded her she had been part of the reason this moment had even happened, and that was a truth she could never unsee. The noise of the terminal swelled around them. Flights continued, passengers came and went, the world moved on. But for Daniel Carter, Victoria Langley, and Sam Reynolds, the moment wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Victoria Langley's role in the incident cast a shadow she couldn't escape. Among the flood of messages she received, one stood out. "What you do next matters. Make it count." The simplicity of the words struck her, cutting through the noise, planting a seed of clarity. She couldn't undo her actions, but she could choose a different path moving forward. Nearby, Colonel Sam Reynolds leaned back in his seat, watching the terminal with a practiced eye. He saw the strain behind Daniel Carter's steady exterior and placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "You holding up all right?" he asked. Daniel nodded, though his expression was thoughtful. "It's not the first time," he said quietly, "but it feels bigger now. More eyes on it." Sam nodded. "Eyes are good," he replied. "People need to see this, but don't let it take more from you than it should. The way you're handling this, that's what they'll remember." Daniel met Sam's gaze and offered a small, grateful smile. The older man's words were a steadying force, grounding him amid the chaos. As the hours passed, Skyway Airlines released a follow-up statement. They announced a comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative, pledging to implement enhanced training for all employees, create a more inclusive workplace. The announcement sparked cautious optimism, though many remained skeptical, waiting to see if action would follow words. Victoria took note of the statement, filing it away as another reminder of her responsibility. The public discourse swirling around her was bigger than anything she had anticipated, and while she couldn't control it, she could control her own choices. Her role in this wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, Daniel stood. He adjusted his uniform with quiet precision. Beside him, Sam Reynolds rose, his bomber jacket a testament to the legacy of those who had paved the way before him. Victoria lingered behind, watching the two men as they walked toward the gate. She straightened her posture, her resolve clear in her steady gaze. The viral video had done more than document a moment of bias. It had become a spark, igniting conversations about dignity, accountability, and the power of grace under pressure. For Daniel, Sam, Victoria, and everyone watching, this was more than a single incident. It was a call to action. A reminder that change often begins with the smallest ripples. The sun cast a golden glow over the manicured lawns of the National Military Aviation Museum. Beneath the soaring arch of a massive hangar, quiet conversations filled the air, mingling with the distant chirping of birds and the faint scent of jet fuel lingering from the museum's operational airstrip. A crowd had gathered. Veterans, airline representatives, dignitaries. Their faces were a mix of anticipation and pride. Among them stood Daniel Carter, now wearing the insignia of Skyway Airlines' chief pilot. Beside him, Victoria Langley, whose badge marked her as a leader in the company's diversity and inclusion program, and Colonel Sam Reynolds, his bomber jacket still worn with pride, carrying the weight of history. The past year had reshaped each of their lives in profound ways. For Daniel, the viral video had been a turning point, casting him into the public eye, not just as a pilot, but as a symbol of resilience and leadership. His promotion to chief pilot was more than a recognition of his skills. It was a reflection of Skyway Airlines' commitment to embracing change. Daniel had embraced the role with quiet determination, organizing mentorship programs for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds, speaking at industry conferences about the importance of inclusion in aviation. Standing among the crowd, he carried the weight of these responsibilities with the same steady composure he had always shown. Victoria's path had been more turbulent. The fallout from the incident had forced her to confront her biases, the systems that had allowed them to persist. It hadn't been easy, but she had leaned into the discomfort, immersing herself in training and education, difficult conversations, self-reflection. Her transition to the diversity and inclusion team at Skyway Airlines had been met with skepticism by some, but she had proven her commitment through action. Designing new training programs, engaging with colleagues and employees, addressing uncomfortable truths. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that these changes weren't merely symbolic. Today's ceremony was a celebration of those efforts. Skyway Airlines was unveiling its new diversity initiative, and the Aviation Museum provided a poignant backdrop. The aircraft on display told stories of courage and innovation, reminders of the sacrifices and progress that had paved the way for moments like this. Victoria glanced at a nearby exhibit featuring the Tuskegee Airmen. Her heart swelled with a mix of humility and determination. This was the legacy she hoped to honor. A legacy of breaking barriers, of learning from the past, of ensuring that the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles alone. The hum of voices grew quieter as the event began. Daniel stepped forward, his posture straight as ever, prepared to speak. Victoria exhaled deeply, the weight of her journey settling over her. 1 year ago, she had been part of the problem. Today, she was part of the change. And though she still had a long way to go, she was ready to keep walking forward. As the ceremony commenced, one truth remained. This was more than just a corporate initiative, more than just a viral moment. It was a movement. And they were only at the beginning. The CEO of Skyway Airlines stepped onto the stage, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. He spoke about the company's renewed commitment to equity and respect, emphasizing that the day's event was more than just a symbolic gesture. Behind him, a banner unfurled, its bold letters reading, "Honoring the past, building the future." The audience responded with warm applause, their expressions reflecting a cautious but hopeful optimism. As the CEO concluded, he turned toward the guest of honor. "Please welcome our chief pilot, Daniel Carter." The applause grew louder as Daniel approached the microphone, his tall frame exuding the quiet confidence that had become his hallmark. He paused for a moment, scanning the crowd before speaking. "This isn't about one person or one moment," he began, his voice steady and clear. "It's about what we choose to do every day. To create a world where dignity and respect are not just ideals, but realities." He let the words settle, the weight of his experiences woven into each syllable. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued, "but it starts with us, with our actions, our choices, and our willingness to listen, and learn. As he stepped back, thunderous applause filled the hangar, reverberating through the steel beams above. Daniel's gaze briefly met Victoria Langley's in the crowd. Her expression was one of quiet pride and gratitude. Victoria took the stage next, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She exhaled deeply, steadying herself before she began. A year ago, I was forced to confront the ways in which I had failed to live up to the values I claimed to hold dear. Her voice, though firm, carried the weight of personal reckoning. That realization was painful, but it was necessary. She glanced at Daniel, then at Colonel Samuel Reynolds, who stood near the front of the audience, watching with quiet intensity. Today, I stand here not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who is committed to learning, growing, and making amends. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Change begins with acknowledgement, she continued, but it requires action to take root. Her words landed with a sincerity that couldn't be faked. The applause that followed was not just polite. It was an affirmation of the work she had done to redeem herself. As Victoria stepped down from the podium, her eyes caught Sam's. The older man gave her a small, knowing nod. His weathered face broke into the faintest of smiles. Then it was Sam Reynolds' turn. As he stepped onto the stage, the room seemed to quiet further, the weight of his presence commanding immediate attention. His voice, steady and reflective, carried across the crowd. "I've seen this country at its best and its worst," he said. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that progress is never easy. It's a fight, one that requires courage, humility, and persistence." He took a slow breath, glancing around the room. "Today, we honor those who've taken up that fight, not just in the skies, but in every corner of our lives." A beat of silence, and we remind ourselves that the work is never done. The standing ovation was immediate and heartfelt. The crowd rose as one, honoring the legacy Sam represented. As Sam stepped down, he joined Daniel and Victoria, the three of them standing side by side as the event concluded. Photographers captured the moment, an image of resilience, transformation, and unity. As the crowd began to disperse, the three found themselves in a quiet corner of the museum. Sam leaned on his cane, his gaze drifting over the historic aircraft on display. "You two have done good," he said simply. His voice carried a warmth that softened its gruffness. Victoria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you," she replied. Daniel nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just another beginning." Sam chuckled softly. "That's how it always is," he said. "The work never ends, but that doesn't mean we can't take a moment to appreciate how far we've come." They stood in companionable silence, their connection forged through shared trials and triumphs. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the museum grounds. It was a moment of reflection, a reminder that while the work of progress was unending, the journey itself was worth every step. The soft hum of jet engines vibrated through the hangar as a sleek new Skyway Airlines jet taxied into view, its bold lettering gleaming under the morning sun. A group of young pilot cadets stood in uniformed rows on the tarmac, their faces alight with nervous excitement. Daniel Carter, now a seasoned chief pilot, walked among them, his tall frame and confident stride commanding quiet respect. He paused in front of a young woman, her crisp uniform and steady gaze reminding him of his younger self. "Nervous?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She nodded, biting her lip. "A little, sir." Daniel smiled gently. "Good. It means you care." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "Trust yourself, trust your team, and always fly with purpose." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, weathered set of wings. "These belong to my father," he said, his voice softer now. "They remind me why we do what we do." He handed them to the cadet, who took them with wide-eyed reverence. "Find your own version of that," he told her. "Something that grounds you when you're up there." The young woman nodded, her shoulders straightening with determination. Daniel moved on, offering quiet encouragement to the others, his steady presence a beacon of assurance. For him, this was more than a job. It was a mission, to honor his father's legacy, and to ensure that the skies remained open to anyone willing to rise. Inside the hangar, Victoria Langley stood at a podium, addressing a crowd of employees, executives, and invited guests. Over the past year, she had become a cornerstone of Skyway Airlines' diversity and inclusion efforts. Her transformation had earned her both respect and responsibility. She took a steadying breath before she spoke. Aviation is about breaking barriers, she said, whether it's defying gravity or challenging the biases that hold us back. She scanned the crowd, her voice carrying conviction. Progress demands courage, collaboration, and a willingness to change. Today, we take another step forward, a pause, but the journey is far from over. The audience broke into applause, their faces reflecting both hope and determination. From his seat, Sam Reynolds watched with quiet pride. Beside him, a young boy tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa, did you ever fly one of those planes?" The child pointed to a vintage bomber displayed nearby. Sam chuckled, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I sure did," he said, "and every flight taught me the same lesson. You can't go far without trust and teamwork." The boy nodded solemnly, his wide eyes full of wonder. Sam ruffled his hair. The past would always shape the future. But it was the choices of today that would determine its course. As the event concluded, the crowd gathered near the new jet for a group photo. Daniel, Victoria, and Sam stood at the center. Their presence was a testament to resilience, redemption, and unity. As the camera clicked, the moment was immortalized. A snapshot of progress, built on the strength of those willing to rise. The young cadet's eyes widened as she absorbed Daniel Carter's words, her shoulders straightening with a newfound sense of purpose. Daniel moved on, offering quiet encouragement to the other cadets. His steady presence was a beacon of assurance, a reminder that this was more than just a career. It was a mission. To honor his father's legacy, to ensure that the skies remained open to anyone with the courage and determination to rise. Inside the Skyway Airlines hangar, Victoria Langley stood at the podium, addressing a crowd of employees, executives, and invited guests. Over the past year, she had become a cornerstone of Skyway Airlines' diversity and inclusion efforts, her transformation earning her both respect and responsibility. Her words were measured yet impassioned, carrying across the attentive crowd. "Aviation is about breaking barriers," she declared, her voice strong, "whether it's defying gravity or challenging the biases that hold us back." She scanned the room, her eyes filled with conviction. Progress demands courage, collaboration, and a willingness to change. A pause. Today we take another step forward. A deep breath. But the journey is far from over. The audience broke into applause, their faces reflecting hope and determination. Among the attendees, Colonel Samuel Reynolds sat watching with quiet pride. He had seen history unfold many times in his life, but this moment felt like the beginning of something truly meaningful. Beside him, a young boy tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa, did you ever fly one of those planes?" The child pointed to a vintage bomber displayed nearby. Sam chuckled, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I sure did," he said with a knowing smile, "and every flight taught me the same lesson. You can't go far without trust and teamwork. Remember that, and you'll be ready for whatever life throws your way." The boy nodded solemnly, his wide eyes reflecting his grandfather's wisdom. Sam reached over and ruffled the child's hair, his heart warmed by the knowledge that the stories of the past would continue to shape the future. As the ceremony concluded, the crowd gathered near the Skyway Airlines jet for a group photo. Daniel, Victoria, and Sam stood at the center. Their presence, a testament to resilience, redemption, and unity, spoke louder than words. The photographer called for everyone's attention, and as the camera clicked, the moment was immortalized. A snapshot of progress, built on the backs of individuals willing to confront their fears and biases. After the formalities, the trio found themselves walking along the airfield, the hum of distant engines providing a soothing backdrop. "It's incredible to see how far we've come," Victoria said, her voice tinged with both pride and humility. It's all humbling to realize how much further we have to go." Daniel nodded. "The work is never done," he agreed. "But moments like this remind us why it matters." He glanced toward the horizon, where a departing plane climbed higher into the sky. "It's about making sure everyone has a chance to take flight." Sam, leaning on his cane, surveyed the vibrant scene around them. "Progress is a lot like flying," he mused. "It takes effort to get off the ground. But once you're up there," he gestured toward the vast sky, "you realize it's bigger than you ever imagined." The three paused near the museum's entrance, where a plaque dedicated to the Tuskegee Airmen caught their attention. Victoria reached out, tracing the engraved letters with her fingers, her expression contemplative. "Their courage paved the way for all of us," she said softly. "We owe it to them to keep pushing forward." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And we will," he said, "together." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, its golden hues bathed the airfield in warm light. The sound of a departing plane drew their eyes skyward. Its silhouette cut through the clouds, a reminder of limitless possibilities awaiting those willing to reach for them. Sam's voice broke the silence. "Well, my friends?" He exhaled, glancing between Daniel and Victoria. "I think it's time to let the next generation take the lead." Victoria smiled. "And to make sure they're ready for it." Daniel grinned, his eyes gleaming with quiet determination. "The sky is big enough for all of us." As they turned to leave, their steps aligned, their connection unspoken, but deeply felt. The journey they had shared, full of challenges, lessons, and triumphs, had brought them to this moment. And while their paths might diverge, the bond they had forged would remain a testament to the enduring power of trust, redemption, and unity. Above them, the departing plane climbed higher. Its contrails stretched across the darkening sky, like a promise, a reminder that every flight, every journey begins with the courage to rise. Daniel, Victoria, and Sam walked away from the airfield, their silhouettes framed by the glowing sunset. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a legacy of change. The story of a flight attendant denying a black pilot a first-class seat had evolved into something far greater. It became a beacon of progress, a reminder that dignity, resilience, and redemption can transform even the darkest moments into powerful movements for good. Their journey wasn't just about one confrontation on a plane. It was about what happened after, how people chose to respond, and how real change begins. If you were in their shoes, how would you respond to bias and injustice? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it to spread the message of hope and resilience. Subscribe for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.